Hello, I am Mokshika Sharma. Welcome to the PodLab Experiments in Audience Growth, a mini-series by podcasting MA students at City St. George's University, London. In this episode, we will be talking about episode artwork, how best to implement it, and the wider industry discussions around it. Joining me in this episode is Isabella, Maxit, and Hannah. To kickstart the conversation, Isabella, what are your thoughts on artwork being an integral part of any podcast series?
Well, last week we released our limited series, the pilot series, where we kind of dealt with this issue for the first time. We started thinking about, instead of just having one artwork for the series, we experimented with having individual episode artwork for each episode. And this had a lot of challenges. We had to think about how to make them look like they belong together, like they were part of the same series. I guess it also made us all look into more whether individual episode artwork is something we should be pursuing. And I think there's a few different examples from the industry that one can draw on. You do see increasingly that different podcasts use episode artwork, but you kind of have to ask yourself when this is necessary. And we thought this was a series where it was a good thing to experiment with because each episode is so different from each other. The concept of the series is that each episode is a completely individual pilot episode, but a completely new topic. So there it made sense to experiment with having different artwork for each episode because they're about completely different topics.
So you talk about experimentation with artwork. We are new podcasters. How relevant is using our own identity by, let's say, using our own pictures, integrate them in the artwork for our own podcast? Do you think it's a good idea?
The Pod News newsletter, which I highly recommend, did a special newsletter in February of 2024, which answered this question. And yes, you can use your own images, but obviously you want them to look professional and they have to be high quality. So their recommendations or guidelines, if you like, was to either send it in JPEG or PNG format, the image, and for it to be 3000 by 3000 pixelated. And that way you are welcome to use if you stick by those dimensions, then the quality should be good enough to use. Obviously, don't use explicit images. It also said you can consider using AI. And then the newsletter link provided a link from Transistor to a guide of using AI for podcast artwork, which is interesting given the divisive topic of AI. The article, I found it really interesting. The image of the host is a common factor in popular podcast titles. So there was some research conducted in Germany by an agency called GfK, and it showed the artwork that contained the host face in it was the most clicked on, which is pretty interesting. And overall, their main take was that podcast artwork really can't be underestimated in how discoverable a podcast is. It is second to the title, but it's still really important. Yes, you can use your own image.
I think that makes it more personal, isn't it? That we should actually integrate our own photographs into our artwork. Don't you think that, Hannah?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I guess it depends on the genre of your podcast. If you have it within your skill set to produce top quality photographs, then by all means, I think there's no industry regulations against it. But I think most people pay because they want that high quality logo because it is so important.
So high quality pictures and branding are absolutely pivotal. Another question is also how regularly should we be experimenting in generating new artwork for the podcast series?
I'm not sure how regularly we should be experimenting, but one podcast recently I noticed that has shifted their approach in terms of their artwork is The Guardian's Today in Focus. So that one is a similar show to our magazine show here on City Sounds, where they have a show called Today in Focus, and each episode has a different theme or particular subject area. Again, similar to City Sounds, the magazine show, just a quick plug. And what I found quite interesting is they moved away from having a consistent episode artwork to having individualized episode artworks, depending on what the subject is about. But for me, I'm not really sure that worked because I listened to them on Spotify, and it doesn't necessarily, I don't know what else it adds value to be honest, because again, going back to what Hannah said, the first thing I look at is the title of the episode and then a little description of what it's about. The episode picture doesn't really do much for me.
It's interesting you say that because I read a blog recently about this by Adam Bowie. He used The Daily by the New York Times as the biggest example. They did a similar shift maybe like last year where they have individual episode artwork, but it's just a plain photo. It has no graphics or anything identifying it to the New York Times whatsoever. And this is kind of, he debates this a little bit in his blog post because he uses a third-party podcast provider called Pocket Cast. And when he just sees all his podcasts in a list in Pocket Cast, there's nothing to show him what podcast this is. He can't identify that it's The Daily at all. So in his blog post, he kind of goes through how it looks on different podcast providers, which is something that I guess as a podcaster, you should take into account if you're experimenting with episode art. So on Spotify, you could still see the show art in some places, but if you're just scrolling through the feed, you do just see the photo. But then the place where this approach worked the best was Apple Podcasts, because in Apple Podcasts, you will always see a little graphic of the show art inside the photo of the episode art, which obviously raises some new problems. Like if you do have a graphic on top of the photo, then you get like a double graphic, which can look a little bit awkward. So I guess my takeaway from reading this is that as a podcaster, you should look at where most of your audience is to see how you tailor your episode art. I had a look at City Sound's listeners and where they consume the podcast most. And our listeners are also mostly through Apple, which is maybe a way that we could experiment more with episode artwork without risking losing the City Sounds branding. But it is worth noting that when you see it in Apple Podcasts, it might look a little bit busy if we have like overly edited episode artwork, because then we would also have City Sounds show artwork as like a smaller square in the middle, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense actually. But I guess when we kind of zoom out a bit, we are talking about artwork, of course, but I think this goes back to the central question for all podcasters, right? Which is about discoverability. How do people find your content? What attracts them to it in the first place? And obviously, we all know Lucy Antonatos. She recently wrote an excellent blog post on LinkedIn about this very same topic, about discoverability. And she actually quoted some statistics about how 29% of podcast listeners stated that they find it really difficult to find and come across new shows. It'll be interesting to find out if there is any research to kind of specify what the percentage is of artwork in the decision-making factor for people when it comes to picking a new show. And if we had that kind of data, we could probably implement that into our future shows and experiment with it, which is what you were asking about, Mokshika, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think all really important and relevant points that you all have touched upon in this conversation. So definitely a good artwork not only helps in audience engagement and discoverability, but it also helps the listeners to quickly identify with your podcast brand.
I think the main takeaway from this to podcasters is don't underestimate the importance of the artwork. The research shows that it is actually quite influential in whether people click on it or not. Although we don't know the statistics, like you say, Max, the study that was done in Germany shows that it made a difference.
Yeah, and I would suggest actually, if you are going to experiment with it, to use resources online to preview it. And we will share some of those resources in the show notes, and make sure you click on it below, and we'll share all the other resources that we've discussed today.
That's perfect, and that will be so helpful, specifically when we are trying to get into the zone of creating some very captivating artworks. So happy creating your beautiful artworks. Keep in mind the integral part, and I hope this episode proves to be super useful to you all. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Isabella, Maxit, and Hannah. To hear more about building a podcast community, do listen to the upcoming episodes of PodLab, Experiments in Audience Growth, right here on City Sounds. You can also explore our other series, like the City Magazine Show, the Pilot series, and the Place to Start, available wherever you get your podcasts.